Hey friends, Route 20 guy here, and today we're in a very different place than our videos usually come from. Route 20 is right over there, and we're in Garden Prairie Cemetery, which is just east of the little hamlet of Garden Prairie, Illinois, and that's east of Belvedere, Illinois, between Marengo and Belvedere. Last night we were visiting Belvedere with some friends, and we're told a story about an infamous murder case that happened here in town, and I was like, wow, this is kind of cool. You know, we don't usually cover that on our site, but you know, this happened in the 1800s, so I'm like, let's learn a little bit more. At first it sounded a little bit far-fetched, but then I dug into it some more. So I came out here, and first of all, is this the headstone for the person, Daniel Stott. It's right here, this one right here. Daniel Stott. It's getting very faded now. Died in 1881, and so of course over 100 years ago. And at the bottom, if you look really close, and I'll zoom in, it says poisoned by his wife and Dr. Cream. Do you know who Dr. Cream is? I never heard of Dr. Cream, but when I looked him up, I was like, I remember hearing about him somewhere. So here's a little story of what happened to Daniel Stott and that infamous murder spree of Dr. Cream back in the 1800s. Dr. Thomas Neill Cream was born in Scotland in 1850. He moved with his family to Canada in 1854. By 1876, he had obtained a medical degree and began a practice outside of Quebec. He traveled between Canada, Iowa, and back to Canada several times during his early career. While back in Canada, he courted a woman named Flora Brooks. During their courtship, she became pregnant. It was a little bit of a heartache for both of them because they weren't ready to settle down, especially Dr. Cream. He was a free-spirited person, according to some of the articles that we've read. So this really was bogging him down, and since he was a medical doctor trained in surgery, he had performed an abortion. However, that failed, and she remained pregnant with the baby. However, her father found out about this and was livid because, you know, of course, this was a very taboo topic back then. So he forced Dr. Cream to marry his daughter. He reluctantly did so, and they got married, but the next day, Dr. Cream fled the country and went back to England. So not a really nice guy. About a year later, he had learned that his wife had passed away of natural causes, and therefore he could come back to Canada without any repercussions, and he was a widow, so he could, you know, freely date again. Well, he came back to Canada, tried to set up practice, but some of his credentials and paperwork was not in order, and he could not practice legally in Canada, so he relocated to Chicago, Illinois, and set up his office in the red light district. Of course, while here, his specialty was performing abortions on some of the ladies in the area. Another thing he did while he was in Chicago was he developed a remedy, a medication, a pill that you could take that would help prevent epilepsy. This was just a small capsule and a very, very small dose of strychnine in it. Now, strychnine was used as a drug for certain things in very, very small doses. In small doses, it may have actually helped a little bit with the epileptic seizures. So he touted this in local newspapers in Chicago, and that went out throughout the countryside. This is where we lead to a location now on Route 20 in Garden Prairie, Illinois. A man named Daniel Stott saw this ad in the paper and thought, well, this was a remedy for him. Daniel Stott was a passenger train agent for the Chicago Northwestern Railroad. He was older, 77 years old, so he was pretty up there in age at that time. He had several ailments, including epilepsy. And so one day he boarded the train into Chicago, made an appointment with Dr. Cream to meet with him, and he got a prescription for this miracle cure. When that first prescription ran out, he sent his wife, Julia, who was only 33 years old at the time, to go into Dr. Cream's office and pick up a new prescription. While on her visits to Chicago, her and Dr. Cream started a relationship. It is not known who actually instigated what would happen next, but she came back several times with the small doses of this miracle pill. Her husband would take it, feel fine, and then go on. On the morning of June 11th, 1881, Julia Stott left Garden Prairie, Illinois, to head into Chicago to pick up another prescription from Dr. Cream. She spent the night and returned the next day. Upon her return, she learned that her husband had a very sleepless night, and she prepared the medication promptly to give to him. Within 20 minutes, he was dead. Many people in town thought it was natural causes. He was 77 years old. He had several ailments. He had epilepsy, and this was just a natural cause, and nobody thought anything of it. A few weeks went by, and the coroner's office received a letter from a Dr. Cream in Chicago, Illinois. How intriguing. The letter said that they should look into Daniel Stott's death a little bit closely. He believes he died of strychnine poisoning. A little bit, self-assuring of this. So the coroner's office, they hemmed and hawed for a little bit. They talked to his wife. Nobody was willing to pay to do this. But then some funds came up when Julia decided, yes, this would be a good idea. Let's get down to the bottom of this and see what happened. So they dug up his body and they performed some tests. Lo and behold, they found a lethal dose of strychnine in Daniel Stott's body. He had been poisoned. This really was kind of interesting because you have this doctor writing a letter saying, hey, look into this. And the wife was actually going along with this. But the only two people who had access to the medication were Dr. Cream and his wife. So a warrant was actually issued for both of their arrests, and they were both found. Julia immediately taken to the county jail, where she sobbed and cried and said she had nothing to do with this whatsoever. It was all Dr. Cream. Dr. Cream fled for a little bit, but they eventually found him, brought him back to Belvedere in the county jail, and locked him up. While Julia Stott was in jail, she said, I didn't know the medicine was poison. Dan was good to me. Dr. Cream told me that he was working on a plan to poison people so that he could sue some Chicago drugstores, but I didn't think that he would poison Dan. She fell screaming on the floor, claiming that she was innocent. This quickly went to trial in September of 1881, and the district attorney and the state went to prove that Daniel Stott was a victim of a diabolical poison scheme evolved by Dr. Cream. We expect to show that he used Mrs. Julia Stott to carry out this plot, by means of which he hoped to collect thousands of dollars in damages from reputable Chicago drugstores. They claim this drug which Mrs. Stott gave her husband on that fatal Sunday morning, June 12th, was harmless when it was sold to her, but after she visited Dr. Cream, he had laced it more with the poison. The defense tried to say that surely a guilty man does not proclaim the fact that he has committed murder if no one else is aware of it. The defense intends to prove that Mrs. Stott alone is guilty of this murder and is merely trying to shield herself by laying the blame of her aged husband's death on Dr. Cream. Dr. Cream sat in the courtroom. He was 40 years old and smiled throughout the entire trial. Unbeknownst to Dr. Cream and a turn of events, Mrs. Stott turned state's evidence against him and testified that actually this was the case. Dr. Cream was out to get money from the drugstore, saying they had supplied lethal doses of this medication to his patients, and he was innocent of anything. It was the drugstore, and he would claim lots of money. Dr. Cream took the stand in his own defense and said that he firmly believed that Mrs. Stott killed her husband. Every time she came, she would complain about her husband and that she wanted him dead, and therefore she used the medications that he had given her in lethal doses, and that is why he died. It was not his fault. During the trial, it came up that Dr. Cream and Mrs. Stott had an affair, which both of them adamantly denied. Dr. Cream tried to plead that, yes, it was him who wrote the letters because he was the attending physician for Daniel Stott, and if anything happened, he wanted to make sure that he was in the clear, and he knew something was wrong, and he wanted that to be known. Well, this is all part of a really, really diabolical plan. Interestingly, during the trial, everything changed, and the initial focus for Mrs. Stott shifted to Dr. Cream immediately. It took a jury only 3 hours to come to a conclusion and convict Dr. Cream of murdering Daniel Stott, since Mrs. Stott had turned against him and provided evidence against the doctor. Dr. Cream was taken to Joliet prison, and Mrs. Stott remained free. Dr. Cream remained in prison in Joliet for 10 years, but pressure from the public came in saying that he was mistreated and that it was really Mrs. Stott who did all this. A sympathetic judge pardoned Cream 10 years later in July 1891, and he was free to go. He went back to Canada, claimed an inheritance left by his father, and moved to England. In October 1891, Dr. Cream had returned to London and began practicing once again. He was older, he was not looking as young and good as he was before this trial and his stay in prison. He decided to get right back to where he was, back in Chicago, administering this drug of choice of his, the strychnine. One of the interesting things about Dr. Cream was he was very different from a lot of other serial murderers out there because Most want to see their victims die or see the result of their actions. Dr. Cream did not want to see this. He did not want to see the people die in front of him. In fact, his thing was to administer the medication, read about it in the paper later, and then get that satisfaction. This is probably why he wrote the letter to the coroner's office back in Belvedere, Illinois, because he thought, well, nothing happened, and he could not claim that notoriety that he had committed this murder. Now, also, that was kind of interesting too, because Dr. Cream's victims were most likely young women, unfortunate women, as they were called back then during the day, very poor, and that was who his victims were. Daniel Stott, being 77 and a man, was not really his MO, really. There had to be that connection between the wife, her husband, and this affair going on, and therefore that is why that murder took place. But overall, it was out of the ordinary. But Dr. Cream, now being in London, England, 2 young unfortunate women died early on in October, and then again a few weeks later, other women started dying. They were all pretty much considered to be either natural or food poisoning. But once again, Dr. Cream stuck his nose in, saying, wait a minute, you should look into this. This could be poisoning. Well, this so happens, one of the women in his last case, he gave her these strychnine pills, and she faked that she took them. A few days later, he went to the paper saying a woman died of poisoning and there was nothing written about her. The thing was, she didn't die. She didn't take the pills, and therefore she could go back. They called her in and saying, who is this person? And the woman went back saying, this was the doctor who gave me this pill. They happened to be strychnine. They caught him and arrested him. Quick trial came to be that he was a murderer, and on November 15th, 1892, Dr. Cream was hanged in London, England at the age of 42. His crime in Illinois was never known in London until after his death. So, if you're a true crime person or just interested in some fascinating history that happened here on Route 20, just take a visit, pay your respects at the Garden Prairie Cemetery. We're right pretty much in the middle of the 2 roads coming into the cemetery, right off of Highway 20, which is right over there. So just come in, and it's right in the middle. It's faded, but you can see it right here. And of course, at the bottom, the interesting epitaph. So more interesting facts, stories from Historic Route 20. Take care, everybody.